Welcome to Vernal Pools 101. I'm Brett Thielen, Science Director with the Harris Center for Conservation Education. This slideshow series will introduce you to the exquisite ephemeral world of vernal pools. In 4 slideshows, we'll cover how to know if you've found a vernal pool, how to identify some of the amphibian egg masses you might see in a vernal pool near you, tips for the field, and this slideshow, Why Should I Care About Vernal Pools?, which covers vernal pool ecology and conservation. Let's dig in. I like to call these slides the so what slides. Why should we care? Why does this matter? There's lots of reasons to care about vernal pools, but they're perhaps best known as specialized breeding habitat for a group of amphibians and invertebrates, like the wood frogs pictured here. Vernal pools are depressions in the forest floor that fill with melting snow and spring rains and often dry by late summer or fall. As a result, fish cannot survive in vernal pools, and this matters because fish eat amphibian eggs and amphibian young. So the amphibian species who've adapted to breeding in vernal pools are used to a low predator environment. They cannot survive as well in other kinds of wetlands. And so if vernal pools were to disappear from the landscape, wood frogs and spotted salamanders and Jefferson complex salamanders might disappear too. I really love this picture that shows wood frogs in full breeding mode with egg masses all around them, and especially if you look in the bottom right, you can see a female wood frog laying her eggs right as this picture was being taken. What an incredible moment. Now, the species who breed in vernal pools, like the spotted salamanders seen here, need vernal pools for their long-term survival. And in turn, our forests need the species who breed in vernal pools. One study found that they have a powerful influence on the ecology of the forests surrounding their pools. Here's what that means. One way of measuring the influence a species or group of species have on their ecosystem is the concept of biomass, which in its most simplistic form is a calculation made by multiplying the mass of an individual by the number of individuals that exist in a given place and time. So for instance, if I wanted to calculate the biomass of human beings inside the Harris Center building, I would take my mass and add that to Meade Caddo's mass and Susie Spickle's mass and any other person who was present. Now let's say I wanted to compare that to the biomass of ants or mice or ladybugs in the Harris Center building. Those animals tend to be much smaller in mass, but much more numerous than humans, and so the numbers might surprise you. Ecologists have done a similar calculation for New England forests, and one study in Massachusetts found that the biomass of vernal pool breeding amphibians, so that's wood frogs, Jefferson complex salamanders, and spotted salamanders, was greater than the biomass of all the breeding birds and small mammals in the 53 acres surrounding a single vernal pool. What does that mean? It means that there's an enormous amount of energy moving through our woodlands in the bodies of amphibians. Primarily, this is happening through the food chain. Amphibians are important prey for nearly any animal you can think of: herons and owls and bears and snakes and turtles, and more. They're prey as adults, but they're also prey as young. So this is a wood froglet, a metamorph as they're called, newly emerged from the vernal pool, and you can see how tiny it is by the fact that it's sitting on the tip of someone's finger. It is not uncommon for a small vernal pool to produce more than 10,000 of these froglets. If they're lucky, 10 will make it to adulthood. The rest are food. Even as eggs, they serve as an important food source. If you think about what the New England woods look like in most of April, they're brown and bare. There are very few flying insects out and about. There are a few buds or flowers, no fruits. Most nuts are gone from the landscape by the time spring rolls around. And so it's a very hungry time for animals who have just emerged from winter hibernation. Now, if you're a Blanding's turtle and you stumble upon a vernal pool filled with these nuggets of protein, these gorgeous wood frog eggs, you are going to thank your lucky stars for the meal that provides. So vernal pool biologists called them fast food oases for spring wildlife in New England, and they've been serving that role for at least 10,000 years. Amphibians aren't just important prey, they're also important predators. The American toad featured here isn't strictly speaking a vernal pool species, but it is illustrating an important point about the number of insects and invertebrates that amphibians consume. American toads eat 3 times their weight in insects each day during the growing season, which means 50 to 100 insects a night and up to 10,000 in a season. Inside vernal pools, spotted salamander larvae are important consumers of mosquito larvae. One study found that mosquitoes preferentially selected pools that did not have spotted salamanders in them because they were safer places for the mosquitoes to grow up. Now, I'm not going to tell you vernal pools aren't inherently buggy and mosquito-y places, because they are, but they'd be even more so, as would the rest of our woods, without spotted salamanders there to eat them. There's also some interesting research coming out that indicates that woodland salamanders may play an important role in carbon sequestration. In fact, the New York Times called them the climate change heroes of the forest when reporting on these studies a few years back. The idea here is that there's a group of invertebrates collectively known as shredders that consume dead leaves on the forest floor by shredding them up into bits. And when they do that, a little bit of carbon is released each time into the atmosphere. Without the shredders, the leaves are kind of buried by other leaves in a bit of a wet blanket, and the carbon contained in those leaves is able to be absorbed into the soil more slowly rather than being released into the atmosphere. So salamanders, like redback salamanders, eat these shredders. So the more salamanders you have, the fewer shredders you have, and the more carbon you have being stored into the soil rather than released into the atmosphere. And the scientists who did these studies are able to actually calculate how many pounds of carbon per acre woodland salamanders help fix in the soil. This still needs to be studied across a larger range of places and species, but it's certainly interesting food for thought. As an ecosystem, vernal pools are also important because they have extremely high biodiversity, particularly in relationship to how small they are and how little space they occupy on the landscape. More than 550 different species have been documented using New England vernal pools. Many of these are invertebrates, like the caddisfly, predaceous diving beetle, and fingernail clam seen here. Vernal pools also serve as important wetland stepping stones through the landscape for species that are trying to disperse. One study in Maine found that local populations of turtles, small birds, and small mammals would face a significant risk of extinction after the loss of small wetlands like vernal pools, which serve as places for shelter and for finding food. There are 2 parts to the so what question. The first is the ecological significance of vernal pools and vernal pool breeding species, as we've just discussed. The second is the vulnerability of this habitat and the various threats that vernal pools face, which we'll talk about now. Unlike permanent wetlands, in most places vernal pools are not protected by law. In addition, if you're not looking for them at the right time of year, you might not even know they're there. You need to be looking for vernal pools in the spring when they contain water and are likely to contain amphibian eggs. If you survey for them in October when they're dry or in January when they're buried under snow, you simply might not know they're there and can inadvertently damage them when doing work on the land, as happened here. One of the biggest threats to vernal pools is the direct loss of pools through development, drainage, ditching, or filling. It's incredibly difficult to reconstruct or restore a vernal pool after it's been damaged in such a way. The best thing we can do for them is to protect them before this happens. Another threat is the loss of adjacent upland habitat, woods. Wood frogs, spotted salamanders, and Jefferson salamanders spend a few weeks of the year in their vernal pools courting, breeding, and depositing eggs, the rest of the year they're in and under the woods. If you lose your woods, you lose your wood frogs and your spotted salamanders and your Jefferson salamanders too. This is an aerial photo of a development project that happened in Connecticut, and it's actually a success story. The top left-hand corner, you can see there's some open water. Those are vernal pools. And originally, this was a planned development project that was going to look a lot like what you see on the right-hand side of your screen. When they realized the vernal pools were there, they were able to maintain some connection between those pools and the adjacent woods by reconfiguring their development to allow for connectivity and open space. One study in Massachusetts found that spotted salamanders were unlikely to be present in a given vernal pool if the uplands surrounding that pool were less than 30% forested. Vernal pools are also vulnerable to habitat fragmentation and genetic isolation of the various amphibian populations who breed within them. This diagram by vernal pool ecologist Betsy Colburn shows 3 different scenarios. In the top picture, there are 5 vernal pools labeled A through E and no development. The arrows indicate amphibians who may be able to move from one pool to another for intermingling and breeding and genetic mixing. This creates healthy, robust amphibian populations. In the middle scenario, a road has come through, and that road has created a situation where vernal pools C and D have dried up. It also creates a barrier to movement, so that the remaining pools, A, B, and E, are now isolated from one another without those little pools as stepping stones in between. Isolation in the long term can be bad for amphibian populations because it can lead to lack of genetic diversity, which can make them vulnerable to things like disease. In the third scenario, a house comes in and those other 2 pools, C and D, have dried up again. Because the house is not quite as fragmenting as the road is, there's still some genetic exchange between A and B, but vernal pool E is isolated and on its own. All of these scenarios, other than the top one, are ones in which the vernal pool populations are less resilient and less healthy than they were in an unfragmented landscape. Whenever roads are built near water, whether it be lakes, ponds, wetlands, or vernal pools, road mortality or roadkill is a huge concern for amphibian populations. One jaw-dropping study in Canada surveyed 2 miles of road over 4 seasons and counted more than 30,000 dead amphibians. Another study in New York looked at salamanders attempting to cross a paved rural road, much like the roads you and I drive every day, and found that in the best case scenario, only 1 out of every 2 made it across. Another study in the Berkshires of Western Mass looked just at spotted salamanders. They found lower roadkill rates than in New York, but still predicted that those populations of spotted salamanders could be completely gone due just to road mortality in as few as 25 years. For vernal pools in close proximity to roads, road salt can also be a concern when it runs off the road during spring melt and into the pools. Studies in New Hampshire and New York found reduced survival of spotted salamander and wood frog larvae in the presence of road salt. One of the biggest questions with regard to the future of New Hampshire vernal pools is the impact that climate change will have. Will warmer temperatures cause our pools to dry out sooner each year and to hold water for less time? Will amphibians be able to adapt to these decreased hydro periods? Or will their reproductive success decline? What impact will increased storm frequency and intensity have on our vernal pools? When it comes to development, habitat fragmentation, road impacts, and the potential impacts of forestry, we can protect vernal pools, but only if we know where they are. Unlike permanent wetlands, vernal pools are notoriously difficult to detect via remote sensing. That's why, since 2007, the Harris Center's Citizen Science program has been training volunteers, students, and interns in how to identify and document vernal pools on public and conserved lands throughout the Monadnock region. We call this the Vernal Pool Project. Each spring, we host a volunteer training where we teach people how to identify and document vernal pools. with hands-on practice in egg mass identification. We also have a volunteer handbook, data forms, egg mass ID sheets, and other volunteer materials available on our website at harriscenter.org. Some years we also have maps of potential vernal pools to hand out to folks. These are like a treasure hunt for vernal pools on specific conserved lands. Other years, we just ask folks to go out to the public and conserved lands in their neck of the woods and see what they can find and share their findings with us. Over the years, our volunteers and interns have documented more than 300 vernal pools and a number of potential vernal pools in 15 different towns in the Monadnock region. Pools on public land or for which we have landowner permission to share the data are featured in an online map at harriscenter.org. The green dots are documented vernal pools. The orange dots are potential vernal pools. These are places that look like vernal pools, but when we visited them in the field, we couldn't find evidence of breeding by obligate vernal pool species like wood frogs or spotted salamanders, so they need another visit. If you click on any of these dots in the map, a box will open up with more information about that particular site, including photos if we have them. We also share our data with land managers and planning agencies like the Southwest Region Planning Commission, local conservation commissions, and the land protection and stewardship staff of the Harris Center. Occasionally, we're asked to share it with vernal pool researchers as well. All of this information is collected with the goal of helping to protect vernal pools and inform smart land use planning in the Monadnock region. That wraps up this slideshow, which is focused on vernal pool ecology, conservation, and a little bit about our citizen science project. If you've got questions or would like to volunteer for the Vernal Pool Project in future springs, drop me a line at thielen@harriscenter.org. Thanks for listening.